Rabbi Debra to our community once more. This is actually the third installment of a three-part series that got started a year ago. We hosted you for the book of Ruth before Shavuot last year, and then once again with the book of Jonah. And now we have you for Song of Songs. If it's at least as wonderful as the previous times, we're in for a treat tonight. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you. And thank you to David Zoni and Aviva Orenstein, who I think were instrumental in the nepotism of having me invited. So appreciate it. I'm going to give some background and we'll look at some text. And I want to reserve a good portion of the hour we're going to spend together to talk about why Passover for Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs. It so happened that this week in the most recent meeting of the Westchester Board of Rabbis, there was a guest lecture by Robert Alter, who was speaking on the Song of Songs. So naturally, knowing I was going to be with you, I had to go. And I'm not going to repeat everything he said. He did a lot of reading passages and then reading his translation and speaking about the wording that was very interesting from translation point of view, but not necessarily, I don't think, what would be most compelling for us talking about the ideas behind the Song of Songs. I do want to begin, though, with some things he said about the genre. So I wanted to just quote one thing that he said at this lecture about the dating and the authorship. And I took it down as he spoke. We know from other parts of the Bible that there was a long literary tradition of love associated with vineyards and wells. Song of Songs was probably built on existing earlier poems. We can't say who wrote the poems. Probably there is more than one poet represented. It is perfectly possible, though not demonstrable, that one of the poets was a woman. And this was his lecture just from a few days ago. The general agreement is that this is a third, maybe up to 4th century BCE book, probably not a single poem, but a set of poems woven together. It was interesting to hear Alter's own perspective from his own mouth, not just reading his introduction to the Ariel and Chana Bloch edition of Song of Songs and his own introduction, obviously, to his own translation. What's interesting to talk about also is the genre. And we've talked about this with some of the other biblical books that we've looked at together. It's narrative poetry. It's poetry that tells a longer story, which aside from the Song of Deborah, is rare in the Bible. There are celebratory songs, Song of the Sea, there are poetic songs of remembrance, but to really have a story told through poetry is relatively rare in the Bible. A lot of people read it as an epistolary poem, an exchange, if not of letters, then of messages between the two lovers and even between the woman and the daughters of Jerusalem at different times. And I've actually performed the Song of Songs as a play, as part of a one-woman show. I did some of the monologues and then I did it as dialogues many years ago, back in the day when I was still performing on stage. But it's interesting that Alter rejects the idea that this was a play or presented in a play form, even though in his translation, if you looked at his physical translation, when the speaker changes, he indicates that with a long dash, because it so often happens that we're going from speaker to speaker. Now it's the male lover, now the female lover, now the daughters of Jerusalem, now the watchmen are being quoted. So it seems to me that it reads very well as a series of monologues, dialogues, and even with a chorus of the Benot Yerushalayim, the daughters of Jerusalem. And some of the repetition that happens, do not rouse love until it pleases, I sought him, but I did not find him. Even we'll see the notion of apples repeats. Some of that repetition feels purposeful and dramatic, almost like you would return to a kind of a tagline in a play. And Alter himself points out what he calls some cinematic moments when there seems to be a zooming in of perspective. And we'll look at one of those. So although he rejects that notion, I think it's a pretty live and interesting and good notion when we think about the genre, that it reads like a play, and it certainly has a lot of drama, whatever the genre. When we think about allegory, you don't have to read all these words on the page. This is really, I'll refer to them as we need them. But the allegory of Song of Songs is typically understood to be that the love between the young woman and her lover represents the love between the Jewish people and God. And Robert Gordis, in his book on the Song of Songs, states very boldly that this was a popular series of poems, and that's why it was put into scripture. People wanted to preserve it. And this is an idea that Alter also has. He says that it was probably in some form either drawing on or reproducing existing secular poetry. And his proof for that is that in the Talmud, it talks about, hey, please don't recite Song of Songs in the pubs. And if they're telling you not to recite it in the pubs, the chances are somebody was reciting it in the pubs. That's the idea, that it was in some iteration of it, maybe earlier iterations, actually just love poetry. But Gerson Cohen has a different view that's very interesting, and others have followed in his footsteps, saying that no, really, the allegorical understanding of the book is very, very early, either shortly after the song itself, or maybe even before the song was published, when it was still being verbally performed in pubs, let's say. It already was taking on the cast of religious poetry. And there's a lot of speculation as to what are the proportions, what are the datings of these. Is it really mostly secular poetry that's been dressed up to look religious? Or was it really a religious analogy that we have now become kind of immune to because our love for God doesn't feel that passionate? And one of the ideas behind some of the writing on this is that we shouldn't dismiss the religiosity of the poetry as some sort of fig leaf over sexual imagery, because really the union, the passion, the yearning in particular, the unresolved yearning that happens throughout the book is typical of our longing and love for God. Alter is a big, big fan of the poetry here as poetry. We talked about in some of the other books that he wasn't necessarily a fan of the writing, that he found the book of Daniel to be clunky and a poor use of language. Here, he loves the use of language. However this is allegorized, there's a ripe sensuality here, along with delicacy and refinement. You put all these things together and you understand why Song of Songs is one of the greatest love poems in world literature. Again, these are just my notes from his lecture of the other day. Very new and ripe, and coming after the publication of the book, he's still just as passionate in talking about this book of passion. And he sees it as really both. It's ripe sensuality and its religiosity together. But most of all for him, it's love poetry. Father Andrew Greeley talked about the metaphor as being complex, that it doesn't just say, well, as the young woman is to the young man, so Israel is to God. It's not that simple. It's saying that in human love, there's a hint of divine love. And in divine love, there's a hint of what human love can really be. And so I think the allegory is a little bit more complicated and a little bit more sophisticated than we give it credit for sometimes.
whether or not the allegory was there from the beginning of the Song of Songs, it wouldn't be the first time in the Bible. Hosea, the prophet Hosea, in the 7th century BCE, so some 400 years prior, already allegorized explicitly in his book the relationship between God and Israel as a love relationship between husband and wife. It's explicit.
Right. And not even, there's a great point, and not just Hosea, but some of the other prophets also allegorize marriage. And even in the tablets of the 10 Commandments, you shall have no other gods before me, is right across from do not commit adultery, sort of making the point that there's an analogy between one God, one spouse, the sexual passion and the love passion that exists in those relationships. I want to just look at what is probably the most famous statement of the allegory in rabbinic literature. We always quote the punchline, but it's good to look at the full context. So I'm just going to read from the English. All the Holy Scriptures defile the hands, meaning that when you touch parchment, it could lead to impurity. The Song of Songs and Kohelet defile the hands, meaning they're equally holy. Rabbi Judah says the Song of Songs defiles the hands, but there's a dispute about Ecclesiastes. Kohelet is the name for the book of Ecclesiastes in Hebrew. Rabbi Yossi says Kohelet does not defile the hands, but there's a dispute about the Song of Songs. So one of these two books may not be fully canonical or fully holy. Rabbi Shimon ben Azai said, I have received a tradition from the 72 elders on the day when they appointed Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah head of the academy. We talk about that in the Haggadah, the day that he got appointed to the academy, his hair turned white. The Song of Songs and Kohelet defile the hands. So there's a good tradition to say that both of them are holy. Rabbi Akiva said, God forbid, no person in Israel disputed the Song of Songs, saying that this does not defile the hand. I don't even want to hear it, that the Song of Songs might not have been holy, for the whole world is not as worthy as the day on which the Song of Songs was given to Israel. She'ein kol olam kulo chedai kayom shenitan bo shir hashirim liYisrael. For all the writings are holy, but the Song of Songs is the holy of holies. Shir hashirim Kodesh Kedoshim. It's probably a quote that you may have heard before, but it's good to look at it in the original to see Rabbi Akiva's statement about the allegory. My favorite quote I'll just share with you about the passion of Shir HaShirim and the passion of this allegory is from Saint Bernard, who said, "O strong and burning love, O love urgent and impetuous, which does not allow me to think of anything but you. You laugh at all considerations of fitness, reason, modesty, and prudence, and tread them underfoot." So you just hear the passion that he had. And I was amazed to realize I had not known the number of sermons. I knew that he had written a series of sermons on the Song of Songs. He wrote 86 sermons on the first 2 chapters alone. So this is a guy who really got the passion of the allegory. And similarly, for Saint Teresa of Avila, she said, it will seem to you that there are some words in the Song of Songs that could have been said in another style, meaning maybe not so appropriate if we're talking about God. But in light of our dullness, such an opinion does not surprise me. In other words, we're not passionate enough to appreciate Shir HaShirim. If you loved God the way Rabbi Akiva loved God, or the way Saint Bernard loved God, or if you loved God with that kind of passion, you would understand this allegory better. So they're kind of turning our skepticism back on us. Now, there's one thing that I wanted to point out about the translation. Mostly here on any verses we're going to look at together, I've used Alter's translation, but he likes to compare his translation sometimes to the Jewish Publication Society. So in chapter 1, it says, Tzror Hamor Dodi Li Ben Shaddai Yalim. And he points out that there's a lot of music in the Hebrew. Tzror Hamor Dodi Li. There's a lot of rhythm to it. There's a lot of music to it. So the translation is, my beloved is to me a bag of myrrh. And soror can be a bag, but it typically referred to like a tiny little satchel. So he said a bag is sort of a ugly word for what we're talking about, lodged between my breasts. Yalin, like the modern Hebrew word for a motel is malon. Yalin means to stay overnight or to rest, and it means to dwell, and therefore to lodge, like, the motor lodge is like a hotel. It kind of captures the yalin verb. But Alter's translation is, a sachet of myrrh is my lover to me all night between my breasts, which he lifts up as a much more poetic, much more accurate version of the verse. And his joke about it, he said, when you say it's lodged between my breasts, he said, it makes me think of a chicken bone lodged in your throat. No, it's the music is entirely absent from the JPS translation. So depending on what translation you use, you may have more or less of a sense of the beauty of the Hebrew, but it's a little bit difficult, even I think in the Alter translation, to capture the beauty and the passion of the language.
I always thought the allegory was silly and like a cover story until I studied the works of the Hasidic masters when I was at Hebrew College. And I saw they really meant it. They were not tongue in cheek. They were not wink, wink. They were just so in love with God. And it really came across as genuine and a little cult-like maybe, but not just an excuse for getting some, softcore porn into the Bible.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Hasidic masters, and actually we're going to end with the Hasidic master today. I wanted to look at the intimacy and the distance, because really that prevails throughout the allegory and in the simple story, the plot of these two kids can't get together. That's the nature of any kind of love story, that there's tension and delay and obstacle for the two lovers. But also there's an essential quality of distance that happens between us and God, because there's a natural awe and fear, because there's a natural sense of self-protection, because we don't always want to be so close to God. There's a push me, pull you about our relationship. So there's intimacy and there's distance, and that definitely fits with the analogy between God and the Jewish people. From chapter 3, on my couch at night, I sought him I love so. I sought him, but did not find him. Let me rise and go around the town and the streets and the square. Let me seek him I love so. I sought him, but did not find him. Bikashti et shava nafshi. And he doesn't incorporate the word in his translation nafshi, which you can often see this matzati et shava nafshi, bikashti et shava nafshi at the top of a ketubah, because it means I have sought or I have found, depending on which word they use, the one whom my soul loves. So again, this goes back to the idea that it's not just an add-on, or as Aviva said, a wink, wink, but the one whom my soul loves. A soul connection can be with a human being, and it can also, of course, be with God. The watchman go around the town, found me. Have you seen him I love so? This constant pursuit. I had barely passed on from them when I found him I love so. I held him and did not let him go till I brought him to my mother's house and to the chamber of her who conceived me. I make you swear, daughters of Jerusalem, by deer or by the gazelles of the field, that you shall not stir nor arouse love until it pleases. And so there's a lot of questions here. Is this a dream sequence? Is this really happening, even within the poetry? Who are the daughters of Jerusalem to her? They seem to be her opponents, and yet she keeps going back to them for help. There's this spring imagery of the deer and the gazelles in the field, and the phrase that repeats again later, don't rouse love, ad shetechpatz, and his translation is until it pleases, or some people could even translate it until the time is right. And here I share with you a quote from Harold Frisch called Poetry with a Purpose. He said, the Song of Solomon, another name for the Song of Songs in English, is a long poem of sustained lyric force, unified and powered by this very quality of yearning. This is what I'm pointing out in this chapter. I've sought. The ever-defeated longing and search are the deep core of Israel's history, its phenomenological essence. The greatness of the Song of Solomon is that it expresses this phenomenological essence in its intensest form. It is pure signification, pure poetry. Perhaps that is why it is called the Song of Songs. So he looks at this yearning as being almost historical. How many times in history did God reach out for the Jewish people and we weren't there? We were worshiping idols, not paying attention, unable to hear God's promise. Even in the Passover story, we have, God gives the promise and the people, mikotze ruach u'me'avodah kasha, because of their shortness of spirit and their heavy labors, they can't even hear what God is delivering to them. They can't appreciate it. And then by the same token, how many times did we as a people feel we were reaching out to God and didn't have the sense of a presence on the other end? Where were you, God, when I was reaching out to you? That's an individual question. That's a question that we ask from the pogroms. We have literature dating back to the Middle Ages, where there were piyutim, great poems written with this cri de coeur of where were you, God, while our babies were being slaughtered? Where were you, God? We certainly feel that in time of the Holocaust. So this idea that there's this tremendous love, but also this tremendous yearning in the sense that I keep missing him. I keep looking for him. Where is my lover? And we're going to see that in an even more intense way than chapter 5, which is actually my favorite passage, I think, although I love 8 too, and we'll look at that. Ani yeshena v'libi er. This is one of the most famous quotes from Song of Songs. I was asleep, but my heart was awake. And this is understood in all kinds of different ways. Viva mentioned the Hasidic masters. There's a lot of Hasidic interpretation that this refers to not being fully spiritually mindful and awake, that I'm sleepwalking through life, but there is a part of me that's awake and that's trying to rouse the rest of me and to get my attention, to say there's all sorts of things you're not paying attention to. There's a great story that Zalman Schachter Shalomi used to love to tell, that his daughter Shalvi, when she was going to bed one night and trying to stall her bedtime, asked, Abba, when you go to sleep, you can wake up, right? And he said, right. And she said, when you wake up, can you wake up even more? And that's really the spiritual question that's being implied here. I'm asleep, but my heart is awake. Can I wake up even more? Hark, my lover knocks. This is God trying to get our attention. Kol dodi dofek, another very famous line. Open for me, my sister, my friend, my dove, my perfect one. For my head is drenched with dew, my locks with drops of the night. It's interesting that in his translation, he uses the word locks, because later on we're going to talk about the lock on the door here. He obviously means locks of hair. And this can be seen as a sexual image. Your lover is sort of slick and wet and wanting to come to you and wanting you to open. It's not very subtle. And she says, I have put off my gown How can I don it? I have bathed my feet. How can I besmirch them? So an Alter here just talks in his commentary about his ideas that she's sort of being coy with him. Of course, she wants to open the door, but she's just being coy. But I would say that to the extent this is an analogy about God, I think this is very accurate to how we relate to God's call. That we hear this knock, we have an internal sense that we want to wake up. We say, it's not really a good time. I just got into pajamas. I'm all comfortable here. It's not really a good time. I'm going to have to disturb things in my life, upend things. Things will get dirtier before they'll get cleaner. Things will get messier before they'll be resolved. I'm not so sure I'm up to this relationship. So then it says, Dodi shalach yado min hachor. My lover pulled back his hand from the latch, is how we translate it, but chor literally means hole. Because of the way their locks used to work, there was a hole, and then we even have this now, and then a metal piece, or in their case, it would be a wooden piece that clips through. You can see it in some like bathroom stalls, but there was a hole. So my lover pulled his hand back, or shalach is a familiar word from Passover time, sent his hand back from the hole, and my heart raced within me. Here the Hebrew is so my insides were humming, is how I would translate it. My insides were humming. So it's, again, a very sexual image. And then it says, I rose to open for my lover. My hands dripped with myrrh, my fingers liquid myrrh over the handles of the bolt. So again, he's dripping with liquid, she's dripping with liquid. It's all kind of sexualized imagery. But this is where I mentioned at the start, Alter says this is a very cinematic image, because you almost can zoom in on the bolt as you're looking at this in your mind's eye. I opened but my lover had slipped off and was gone. I went faint when he spoke. I sought him but did not find him. I called him but he did not answer. Again, that elusive relationship and the same language that repeats from the earlier chapter. The watchmen who go around the town found me. They struck me. They wounded me. They pulled my veil from me, the watchmen of the walls. And Alter talks about how pulling the veil could be revealing her as a prostitute, just like Tamar veiled herself in the book of Genesis when she was being a prostitute. Maybe that was a reference here. And by pulling off her veil, they're shaming her. Certainly, in any case, whether she's a prostitute or just a woman out at night, they're pulling off her veil and shaming her. I make you swear, daughters of Jerusalem, should you find my lover, what shall you tell him? That I am a swoon of love. I'm lovesick. Cholat ahava ani. Literally, I am lovesick. Does it recall any moments of love sickness and that kind of passion, that sense of just missing your lover and being half asleep and half awake? There's a debate. Is she dreaming? It almost has the quality of a dream, in which you dream that you're in bed and somebody's knocking, because somebody really is knocking at the door, but you haven't quite woken up yet. And which is real, you can't discern, and you're still in your dream. It's got a lot of layers to it, as kind of a yearning, dream, awake, asleep.
I just wondered how Alter or others interpret the watchman, as like symbolically or metaphorically. Is there discussion about that?
Yeah. So it's variously interpreted. What some people say is that, the watchmen are kind of the villains of the piece in a lot of ways, as the daughters of Jerusalem, for some of it, are the villains of the piece. There are two different choruses that stand in the way of the lovers, and the watchmen are questioning the propriety of the relationship. They're saying she's not worthy of the other lover. And so that is sometimes pictured as other nations saying, who is Israel? That God should, be in a special relationship with them. But here, it comes to a difficult point when they actually wound her. Although, bear in mind, it's a dream. So are they really wounding her, or is this her projection of what's going on and her fear?
I was sort of thinking of it in psychological terms, that the watchman is like the super ego. There's this intimacy between the lovers. They're ready for each other. But maybe there's a voice within her saying, no, you should not be doing this. I'm not sure why you're not ready for this, or you can't do it, or something like that. So it's a struggle within herself as much as the sort of external negative force.
Nice. I love that, David. If we read it as a dream, in a dream, typically you understand that you're all the different characters. You're the lover and that you seek, and you're the lover who's in bed, and you're the watchman, and you're the women in some regard. They're all different expressions of who you are. And that's pretty powerful when you think of it in terms of the Israel God analogy. It means that in some ways we are rehearsing both roles by reading Shir HaShirim. We're playing the role of God even as we read it. Now here's a section. Remember we said, Teresa of Avila said, some parts may seem a little odd to you. This is a section that Alter himself points out as reading strangely to moderns, but that what it's really talking about is the longing for intimacy with God, like the wish that it could just be accepted that we are going to be completely close. Would that you were a brother to me, suckling at my mother's breasts. I would find you in the street, would kiss you, and they would show no scorn for me. So I want you to be my brother because I love you that much. Combined with the sexual imagery, it could be creepy, but Alter sees it as this yearning for closeness and normalizing the closeness, that let us accept it about each other and let the world accept it about us. I would lead you, I would bring you to my mother's house, and she would teach me. I would give you spiced wine to drink from my pomegranate wine. His left hand beneath my head, his right hand embracing me. I make you swear, O daughters of Jerusalem, that you shall not rouse nor stir love until it pleases. And then it goes on to say, who is this coming up from the desert, leaning on her lover? Under the quince tree I roused you. There your mother conceived you. There she who bore you conceived you. But the JPS translation translated, who is she that comes up from the desert, leaning upon her beloved? Under the apple tree I roused you. It was there that your mother conceived you. There she who bore you conceived you. So the Hebrew word is tapuach. And the reason Alter doesn't translate tapuach as apple is partly because there's a debate that says maybe apples didn't exist in that time. He calls it a quince. But this is not the first time that apples are cited as a kind of a refreshing, reviving fruit. Earlier in the Song of Songs, it says, sustain me with raisin cakes and refresh me with apples, for I am faint with love. And this is going to become a really important piece of conversation later when we talk about connections to Passover. Then comes a very famous passage also in the same chapter, in the immediate verse that follows, set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. For strong as death is love. That's the source of the title of Alter's connection. Strong as death is love. Fierce as Sheol is jealousy. Its sparks are fiery sparks of fearsome flames. Many waters cannot pull out love, nor rivers sweep it away. Should a man give all the wealth of his house for love, they would surely scorn him. So these are famous verses that we quote when we put on tefillin. In part, we quote them with weddings and ketubot. And this is also something that we can quote in terms of Passover as well.
So the last word, a fearsome flame, Esh Shalhevet Yah. Yah, the Yah there is God, and it's the only reference to God in the entire Shir HaShirim.
Yes.
In that word. I don't know what to make of that, but it's the only place. It's hardly noticeable. He doesn't even translate it, but
It is translated in the JPS translation. They call it the flame of God.
Okay.
They call it the flame of God, but he doesn't translate it. Yeah, it's a really good point.
And I don't know quite what to make of it. That's the only reference to God in the entire work.
I think that it's another argument for the analogy having been built in and not being the fig leaf afterwards. But I also think that it's talking here about the fearsome flame is not properly respected because people would scorn you if you gave up everything for it. So it's making the point again that we say we love God, but the people who are willing to dedicate their lives to be yearning in this deep way, we think they're a little over the top and we would scorn them.
Yeah, that verse 7 there, that almost seems to be like an editorial comment, like a philosophical comment, more like Proverbs. I mean, to me, it seems it's not the dialogue anymore. It's not the woman talking. It feels like the editor is coming in and making a statement.
Could be. It could be, or it could be kind of like the internal struggle of, am I going to give my heart or am I not going to give my heart? You know, it'll cost me being shamed. And, you know, she is shamed by the watchmen, by the women, whether that's a projection or that's something real. She, in the course of the book, is shamed. But I hear you could read it as a kind of a narrator's intervention there. Well, in our last few minutes, I want to talk about why we read this on Passover. And I'd like to begin just with your thoughts. What are the connections that you see for why typically we read it on the Shabbat of Passover, but it's read different times in different communities? Why Shir HaShirim on Passover as Passover approaches?
Certain words were coming out at me, not as a whole concept, but it made me think about Dam al HaMezuzah, to put the blood on the mezuzah so that I would not, and this is God talking, that I would not kill you and your firstborn. And there were words in there that just brought that image to me. Mavet, you know, just the word Mavet, and the arm made me think of
Arm, death, water sweeping away could remind you of the final miracle.
That warning that, you know, that you will not die.
Right. And then, and azah is an interesting word, like ozi v'zimrat yah. And that the waters are going to save you, reminding us of the walls of water that came and went. That's interesting. And I'm going to show you another version of where in the Midrash, people make links between the text that we have and the text of Exodus, just like you were doing. My dove in the cleft of the rock, in the hiding place of the steep. The rabbis say that's the hiding place of inside the sea, the where you're between the two walls of water and you're kind of protected and going through on dry land. Show me your visage is be still and see the salvation of God. Let me hear your voice is then let Moses sang. For your voice is lovely and your visage is beautiful. Beautiful, same word as Ze'eli ve'anvehu. This is my God, and I will glorify or beautify the divine. So they make this analogy saying the words of Song of Songs are somehow reminding them, just like you were saying, of the words of Exodus.
That the Israelites sort of go from a death culture, which is in a way what slavery is, the work to death, the Egyptians exalt death and so on, the plagues end with death, to, who is it, Isaiah or Jeremiah talks about the imagery of God pursuing Israel in the wilderness, in a sort of open, unconditional way. So it's sort of going from a death culture to a love culture. And Shira Shirim portrays that love culture at its best. Now, when they're in the wilderness, the people also are ambivalent about loving God. They pull away from that. They worship the golden calf. And Moses himself has trouble with the intimacy with God. He yearns for it, but he betrays it at times. But the ideal is in Shira Shirim. So maybe in that way, it's very appropriate.
That's beautiful, Dave. And I would say, that's actually Alter's main opinion. And I like your expression of it, frankly, better than Alter's, because what he says is the time spent in Sinai after Egypt is a honeymoon period. And he also refers to Jeremiah the way you did. That I pursued you in the desert in a land that was not sown. And it was time of love and honeymoon in the desert. That's Jeremiah's vision of what happened on the way in those years of wandering in the Sinai. It kind of, though, that's an argument for reading Song of Songs during the Omer, as we go along the journey between Passover and Shavuot. Not so much about reading on Shavuot. And I think your point combined with his really is a beautiful completion, because what you're saying is it's not just that they're out of Egypt and on their way someplace else. It's that the answer of love is in reply to the culture of Egypt. And they're undoing that and unseating that for themselves. I'm going to share just a couple of more ideas. The simplest one, and it's a lovely one, is that there are connections to spring. And this is the holiday of spring, Chag HaAviv. My lover spoke out and said to me, this is from chapter 2, arise, my friend, my fair one, go, for look, the winter is past, the rain is gone away, buds can be seen in the land. The nightingale season has come, and the turtle dove's voice is heard in our land. The fig tree has put forth its green fruit, and the vines in blossom waft fragrance. So there's a beautiful, poetic, gorgeous description of spring that could connect to our festival of spring. My favorite reason is that there's a connection back between apples that we flagged earlier, or quinces to use Alter's term, and women. And we'll look at the Talmud itself. I'll read through it quickly. The Talmud says, in the merit of righteous women that were in that generation, the Jewish people were redeemed from Egypt. It's because of the righteous women. You can think of the midwives, you can think of Pharaoh's daughter, you can think of Miriam. They're going to tell a story that it's not just those famous righteous women, it's the women as a whole who did something heroic. He tells of their righteous actions. At the time when these women would go to the river to draw water, typical woman's labor, the Holy One, blessed be God, would materialize for them small fish that would enter their pitchers, and they would therefore draw pitchers that were half filled with water and half filled with fish. And then would come and place the 2 pots on the fire, 1 pot for hot water for washing their husbands, and 1 pot of fish with which to feed them. The fish were considered an aphrodisiac. And they would then take what they had prepared to their husbands to the field, and would bathe their husbands and anoint them with oil and feed them the fish and give them to drink and bond with them in sexual intercourse between the sheepfolds, between the borders and fences of the fields, as is stated when you lie among the sheepfolds, which is interpreted to mean the reward for when you lie among the sheepfolds, the Jewish people merited to receive the plunder of Egypt. Okay. And when these women would become pregnant, they would come back to their homes. And when the time for them to give birth would arrive, they would go and give birth in the field under the apple tree, as it is stated, under the apple tree. This is what we saw before. I awakened you. There your mother was in travail with you. There she was in travail and brought you forth, the place where your mother gave birth to you. And the Holy One, blessed be God, would send from the heavens above an angel who would clean and prepare the newborns, just as a midwife prepares the newborns. And there's quotes for that from Ezekiel. This indicates that there were no midwives to take care of the Jews born in Egypt. And once the Egyptians would notice them, realizing that they were Jewish babies, they would come to kill them. Because after all, that was the instruction, kill all the boys. But a miracle would occur for them and they would be swallowed by the earth. It's like the grass would come and cover them. After the Egyptians would leave, the babies would emerge and exit the ground like the grass of the field. And when the Holy Blessed One revealed the divine self at the Red Sea, these children recognized God first. As it is stated, this is my God, Ze'eli, and I will beautify or glorify God. They recognized God from the previous time that God had revealed the divine self to them in their infancy, enabling them to say, this is my God. And in one of the commentaries, it says, why do they give birth specifically under apple trees? Because the apple tree first produces its fruit and only then produces protective leaves. The women thus declared that they would do likewise, first give birth to their fruit, and then God would come and protect and redeem their offspring. So this is equal and neglected reason for charoset. There are two reasons given for charoset. One is zecher latid, in memory of the mortar, because the sort of mud-like thick structure of the apples with the walnuts or the dates, whatever different cultures within Judaism use, that is meant to represent the mortar of the bricks. But also zecher latapuach, in memory of the apple tree, that shows the bravery of Jewish women first to seduce their husbands, to commit to a culture of life and love as opposed to death, as David Zoni said, and then to have the kind of a tremendous will to give birth silently so as not to call attention to themselves and endanger their children. They were these heroic, brave figures. And then all the imagery of, God being the personal midwife, or the angels being the personal midwife, and the land covering them over to help them out so that they wouldn't be discovered. Lots of beautiful, kind of mystical and even sometimes comical imagery, but to emphasize that it's the women who really initiated the miracle by giving birth silently under the apple trees.
How could the Talmud say there were no midwives in Egypt? I mean, we know from the Torah there were no midwives to take care of the Jewish mothers. We know from the Torah that there were midwives.
Right. So what they're saying is that, remember, after Shifra and Puah, they were sort of considered useless because they couldn't get the job done of killing the boys. They said, what can we do? The women, they give birth so quickly and so many of them, we can't do anything. It was their kind of passive, aggressive, civil disobedience to lie to Pharaoh that way.
Mm-hmm.
And he believed them because he regarded Jews as subhuman, the Israelites as subhuman. So he believed them. So from that time on, they're saying there were no midwives caring for them because the reason for the midwives was really to be an intervention, an outside intervention for their destruction. And when it didn't work, then it became just throw all the boys into the Nile. I want to just emphasize that when you go over when you discuss Charoset this year, one of the things you might decide to do is to talk about the double meaning of the Charoset, that it refers to the slavery in terms of the mortar, but also to the sweetness of the heroism of the women who are brave enough to give birth under the apple trees, the proof text for which is from Song of Songs. So That's yet another connection between Song of Songs and our Seders. Last thing I'll point out is about Charoset is that the rabbis say already in the Mishnah that the reason apples are used is because apples themselves are a double symbol. They are both sweet and tart. And the tartness represents the slavery and the sweetness represents the freedom.
What does Alter give as the reason for no apples? He doesn't use the word apple, and I've heard Garden of Eden was about figs, not apples. What is that about?
Well, Garden of Eden, it really just says, it doesn't specify which fruit. But a lot of historians don't believe there were apple trees in ancient Egypt. They just don't think that was a fruit then in that part of the world. So therefore he translated it as quince.
Doesn't it matter more what they thought in the time of the Talmud? And if they thought it was apples, shouldn't that maybe override what was actually there in ancient Egypt?
It's a fair point. I think so. But also I think, it's hard to know, even if they were using the same term, doesn't necessarily mean that it's the fruit that we think of today, like the Washington apple. It may have been a smaller, tartar fruit, it seems to me, based on what the Talmud says, than what we're used to. We're used to a sweeter fruit, but there are people who specialize in this, but I'm kind of with you, Jenny. I feel like, what does it matter? It matters what the rabbis thought, and it matters what it means to us today. Now, I promised you to end, I'll just close with this last quote, and it's from one of the Hasidic masters. As Aviva mentioned, they really had a beautiful and passionate love for God. So this is what Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev said about the Song of Songs. We learn from the Song of Songs that we have merited to sing to him songs of love. That's the big takeaway for him. It's like, wow, I am worthy to sing a love song to God. And therefore it is Shir HaShirim. It is a song about songs, that the whole book is there to remind you that you can sing to God. Well, thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure, as usual, talking to Bloomington, Indiana, and also California zoomed in, and New Jersey. So I think we've covered a lot of the country.
Thank you very much for joining us. Wishing you and everyone here a sweet and redemptive Pesach.
Amen. Thank you. Shalom.